Thanks, Jonathan. Thank you. I'm going to focus on mostly human rights, okay? And I'm also going to address, even though it's not part of the grade, human rights in the occupied territories, because I don't think that's actually covered anywhere else in the conference, and it needs to be, I think, discussed and highlighted. I'm not going to talk about the election. Steve and Katie did an excellent job of that, except to say I was also an observer for OSCE. The OSCE, NDI, IRI, all the legitimate international observers basically concurred. You know, these elections were basically free and fair. They were competitive. They reflected the will of the people, which is not to say, too, they were perfect or completely problem-free, but that's a separate discussion. So on to Russian-occupied Ukraine. The human rights, freedoms, democracy situation for millions of Ukrainian citizens of Crimea and the occupied territories is nothing short of appalling. It affects 10 to 15% of the population. You know, we all know about the more than 13,000 deaths, tens of thousands of other casualties, the humanitarian crisis affecting nearly 5 million people, the at least 1.3 million IDPs, or that's the amount that's registered, who have left occupied territories. So clearly Russia's brazen assault on a rules-based international order, including violating all 10 core foundational principles of the OSCE's Helsinki Final Act, have not only geopolitical consequences, but they affect the real lives of real people, of Ukrainian citizens. Now, the State Department's latest human rights country report on Ukraine in discussing the situation in occupied territories just captures how bad the situation is. You see enforced disappearances, torture, unlawful detention, home searches, threats. In Crimea, this especially applies to those peacefully resisting the occupation, which tends to be Crimean Tatars, as well as Ukrainian, pro-Ukrainian activists. And indeed, these groups also face linguistic, educational, and cultural discrimination. Both of the occupied territories, surprise, surprise, are characterized by severe restrictions of freedom of expression, press, association, assembly, etc. In addition, in the occupied territories of Donbass, the Russian-led forces commit gender-based violence, they restrict movement of the line of contact in eastern Ukraine, and unduly restrict humanitarian aid. On the religious rights front, a U.S. government commission on international religious freedom described the Russian proxy warlords in the Donbass as deeply suspicious towards religious groups other than the Russian Orthodox Church. They continue to persecute religious minorities through legal restrictions, confiscation of property, prosecution of clergy, harassment of congregations, etc. And the Ukrainian Orthodox Church, formerly of the Kiev Patriarchate, but now the name's changed, as you know, Jehovah's Witnesses and various Protestant denominations are especially hard hit. Crimea, the situation's similar, although they're also the Crimean Tatars and other Muslims are persecuted for their religious beliefs as well. Bottom line is human rights, rule of law, and democracy in the so-called republics in Crimea is nothing but a sham. Now, some 115 Ukrainian citizens, including 70 from Crimea, names that might be familiar to you, such as Sentsov, Kolchenko, Boluch, Hussein Kuku, Bekirov, Umerov, Kriv, Lig, Sushchenko, and others, are unjustly imprisoned in either Crimea or the Russian Federation for their political views or religious beliefs. And this is ongoing, this continues. So just in the last few weeks, we have more reports of torture of some of these people in Russian detention. Also reports in the DNR and LNR of confiscation of homes and the continued holding of reportedly several hundred, the exact number isn't known for various reasons, hostages and prisoners of war, as well as the forcible handover of the Ukrainian Orthodox Church to the Moscow Patriarchate in the Donbass. And then we have the 24 crew members detained, in the Kerch Straits back in November. Russia continues, as we know, to detain them, despite the recent UN International Law of the Seas or Maritime Tribunal ruling ordering the Kremlin to immediately release them. And of course, the Kremlin's been thumbing its nose at that, as they have on so many other things. So, to conclude this part, Moscow's ongoing repression of Ukraine's sovereign territories has left numerous victims in its wake. I think in some ways it's more reminiscent of the late Soviet period, the Brezhnev period, than it is of 21st century Europe. And one can't give anything, I know this grade doesn't count, but what they get is basically a big fat F on that. Both are black holes as far as human rights are concerned. And by the way, this whole complex of human rights issues, the sort of gap between occupied and the rest of Ukraine, including such issues as property rights, which the Russians and their proxies have violated with impunity, will only complicate any peace settlement negotiations, and those are going to be tough enough to begin with. Now, on to Ukraine proper, or Kiev-controlled Ukraine. So compared to the occupied territories, Ukraine's a relative paradise. I say relative. The government does generally respect rights and freedoms of speech, association, media, religion, but not always. There's room for improvement. And that's why Ukraine, according to the authoritative Freedom House rankings, you have free, partly free, and not free as the categories, only remains still at partly free. Snapshot comparison, maybe for your interest, with their neighbors. Russia and Belarus, no surprise there, not free. Slovakia, as well as Romania and Bulgaria, well, Bulgaria is not quite a direct neighbor, but close enough, but those two countries I mentioned because they're the poorest EU countries, in some ways more similar to Ukraine, but both of them are in the free category, as is Poland, although there's been a little bit of slippage in Poland in recent years. And then there's Ukraine's neighbor Hungary, which under that great friend of Ukraine, Viktor Orban, yes, I'm being sarcastic, has deteriorated to partly free and is the only EU country which is partly free. And then neighboring Moldova, you may have heard there's a little bit of ongoing political turmoil there right now. It's similar to Ukraine in many respects, including sort of suffering from the disease of corruption, but they're also in the partly free category. Ukraine, just to remind people, was actually in the free category for about 3-4 years when Yushchenko was president, but they lost that status before Yanukovych came to power, or after, when Yanukovych came to power, I should say. So Ukraine be further along, possibly back in the free category, I think, if it weren't for the ongoing Russian aggression. The war, for instance, just to cite one example, aggravates the tension between national security and free speech issues. And that's not unknown even in more advanced democracies such as our own country and European countries, some European countries. And there's definitely a gray area here. But that doesn't mean Ukraine shouldn't strive to do better. They've been in a free category before, and they can do it again. So just a few areas that Ukraine needs to work on. Again, according to the State Department annual country report, there were human rights issues even in government-controlled Ukraine, including sometimes, frankly, torture, arbitrary arrests, incommunicado detention, and other abuses committed. And I'm going to quote the department's report. In the context of the Russia-induced and fueled conflict of the Donbas region. Obviously, these kinds of abuses are much more prevalent and systematic in the DNR and LNR. But then you have long-standing problems, and they're not unique to Ukraine, problems that aren't necessarily war-related, including abuse of detainees by law enforcement, harsh and life-threatening conditions in prison and detention centers, arbitrary arrests and detention. And a big issue has been the government's failure to adequately address steps to prosecute or punish officials who committed abuses resulting in a climate of impunity. Whether it's alleged human rights abuses committed occasionally by the SBU. The SBU does a great job in many areas, but they've been known to take a few shortcuts, if you will, occasionally in the human rights sphere. Or, for that matter, the perpetrators of the 2014 Euromaidan shootings in Kyiv, who have yet to be brought for justice. And also, we've seen a spate of attacks on human rights defenders and anti-corruption activists. The best-known case was the Katya Handzuk case, who died after an acid attack. And you know, as well as attacks on journalists, and these remain a problem. Were more than 50 attacks last year, and many are not properly investigated by authorities, especially local authorities, who sometimes allegedly are also complicit, you know, including this initially happened in the Katya Handzuk case, but following public pressure, and this is also a testament to Ukraine's vibrant civil society. And just last week, 5 men who planned and attacked her received jail sentences for between 3 and 6 years, although those who ordered the killing have yet to be prosecuted. I'm not going to go into the media, of course, for the lack of time. Media freedom and internet freedom ratings also from Freedom House are partly free. In part, that's for national security related issues, and I'll leave it at that. Although the Ukrainian media, as we all know, it's a complicated picture, but it is vibrant, pluralistic, independent. There's plenty of criticism of the government and of corruption. So, and then, while the rights of ethnic and other minorities are by and large respected, the Roma still face violence and discrimination, as they do in many other countries in Europe, as do other groups, sometimes, for example, LGBT, mostly from far-right neo-Nazi groups who disrupt their meetings occasionally. So to conclude, it's impossible to cover everything, you know, but the grade I'm going to give Ukraine right now is a B-, which, if I remember correctly, was similar to my assessment from last year. Okay, I'm talking about Kyiv-controlled Ukraine, of course. So one can point to freedoms generally being respected, democratic elections, which Steve and Katie talked about, and which I saw too, you know, with the OSCE. In areas of small progress in the rule of law areas, such as establishment of an anti-corruption court. And just the other day, the Constitutional Court ruled that forcing anti-corruption activists to provide their e-declarations of income is unconstitutional. That's a positive step, because that had been an issue and a problem. At the same time, we saw lack of progress and even some backsliding in other areas, such as the taking away of criminal liability for illicit enrichment. And just last week, unfortunately, the Rada voted down Zelensky's anti-illicit enrichment law. If we would, for example, I think, have seen passage and even the beginnings of implementation of laws that have been introduced back in 2017 but have gone nowhere since then, such as electoral reform with, and I'm biased towards this, an open party list system, or on parliamentary immunity or other anti-corruption measures, or more efforts to strengthen anti-corruption architecture by stopping political interference into NABU and others, or greater independence of the judiciary, or comprehensive reform of the SBU, especially getting it out of dealing with economic crimes where there's a lot of corruption and letting it do what it does best, you know, countering Russian aggression, or fewer attacks on anti-corruption activists and journalists, then I would gladly have given a higher grade. And let's see and let's hope that with a new president, government, and Rada, this year Ukraine will be able to move into the free category, and maybe instead of a B-, have a A- when we meet again next year.